Thanks for joining us here on 90s Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. The Russia and Ukraine war continues to slog on, but the big story just a few days ago was a plane crash just outside of Moscow that killed Yevgeny Prigozhin, a name that might be familiar to you because he was at the time, about 2 months ago, he led a brief mutiny against Vladimir Putin, the head of the Russian state, of course, and that was the gravest threat to Putin's power in about 20 years. Prigozhin, though, of course, also led the Wagner military group, which has been enlisted to really help out in the eastern part of Ukraine in terms of the Russian war efforts, and notably helping take back the city of Bakhmut for Russia. So, very, very complicated situation, but joining us with a bit more about this is CU Denver professor Christoph Stevens, kind of explain things a little bit about what's going on here. But first of all, this plane crash that took place with Prigozhin, he, amongst 10 people on board that plane that went down, including the number 2 of the Wagner military group as well. This seems, based on U.S. assessments, initial U.S. assessments, to have been deliberately done. Is that your belief as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, Putin had to send a clear message, and the message was, you cannot betray me, you cannot stand up against me. And this killing was also very symbolic, right? So Prigozhin had shot down, during this mutiny 2 months ago, several fighter jets, and so now he died in a jet as well, and exactly 2 months after the mutiny. So, like, this is not coincidence. That's exactly 2 months after the mutiny. And that also means, of course, the end of the Wagner Group, because it was not just number 1 and 2 on that plane, but also number 3, 4, 5, and so on. So this is this was a clear signal that Putin sent, no doubt.
And is that signal basically there's no pushback against the Russian president here? And last time we spoke, you said that Putin was left in a much weakened state after the mutiny. Do you believe this to be him reasserting control? And if so, is this effective?
Yes and no. But first of all, yes, he kind of has reasserted his control of the system. I think, okay, you know, I study dictatorships quite a bit. So for us, it's always interesting to see how elites turn against their leaders. And elites usually do not turn against their leaders, if they are handsomely rewarded by the leader and they can only get their fortunes through the leader. And then second of all, if they fear the leader. So both have to work together. And with Prigozhin, the problem was that he was active, the Wagner Group that he was heading was active all over Africa. So he was making a lot of money from these various African regimes outside of the usual hierarchy, the power vertical, as we call it in Russia. So Putin had little control over the streams of money that was coming towards Prigozhin. So, and then on the other hand, Prigozhin also became a threat, as we have seen 2 months ago, and also being an outspoken critique of the Kremlin before. So in many ways, he became a real threat to the system. So what Putin did was essentially showing that if you are not in line, you are going to be killed. And this, in a way, sends a message to the other oligarchs and the other members of the inner circle that supports Putin. On the other hand, the inner circle now is, of course, quite aware that there are weaknesses, that Putin is not the almighty, and that he can be challenged. So it's a yes and no, because you cannot take back what happened 2 months ago. At the same time, Putin now showed that, oh yeah, but you know, if you are not doing what I want you to do, I'm gonna kill you. We will see how this plays out, but most analysts agree that since this mutiny, Putin's position has been weakened in the Russian political system.
I guess from the broader context of the invasion of Ukraine, the eastern part of the conflict, which right now still appears to be mostly stagnant. And the Ukrainians have attempted a counteroffensive, advanced a few miles, but the Russians have put in such kind of intense lines of defense that has made it very difficult for the Ukrainians to advance. How does this kind of play in, this Prigozhin killing, also the sacking of Sergei Sorokin, one of the top generals of the war effort as well? What's the kind of overall state of the war? And I'm kind of specifically asking that about where's Putin's head at specifically right
now? Well, the situation in the south of Ukraine, southeast, is actually a little bit better. We just recently, I think yesterday or the day before, we heard that they have made some progress there. They already overcame, so Ukrainian forces overcame the first line of defense. So that's good news for the Ukrainians. Further north, it's not going so well. But listening to many military analysts, I'm a political scientist, not a military analyst, so I have to listen to the experts. And all the experts say is this was to be expected. The Ukrainians have to actually see where the weaknesses are, how the Russians react. They have to see which weapons are actually used. And the Ukrainians become more and more effective. I mean, they have been for a while, but I think now with new weapon systems being delivered from the West, to reach behind the lines and hit communication, hit leadership, hit other transportation hubs. So I think it's going pretty well for the Ukrainians overall. Not as good as we had all hoped, but I think that was a little bit too optimistic. So Putin is definitely playing for time, and he can, because if we are continuing delivering weapons at this speed, which is too slow, the Ukrainians will not make much progress. And the elections are coming up in the United States. And as you have recently heard with the Republican debate, there are numerous Republican presidential candidates, including Donald Trump, who would not want to support Ukraine any further.
And perhaps you're starting to see some cracks of that as well. I think Viktor Orban, the head of Hungary, came out and said that I think time's running out as well. I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but are we starting to see some cracks in that Western alliance that has been fairly formidable so far throughout the Ukrainian war effort? Are we starting to see some cracks in that? And if so, would that potentially mean that time's running out for the Ukrainians in terms of getting some of that support from the West?
I don't think that the cracks are any more significant than they were like a year ago. Viktor Orban of Hungary was already then, how to put it, relatively pro-Russian and being against and trying to undermine the European Union's attempts to support Ukraine. I don't think that anything has changed here much. The same with the Austrians that try to be neutral. I think the 300-pound gorilla in the room is definitely the 2024 elections and what's going to happen afterwards. Right now, I don't see an immediate threat to the unity of the Western alliance. That might change with a Republican president.
With the war itself right now, we're now late in August as we record this. We're heading into, I believe, the mud season in the eastern part of Ukraine starts in October, which means that we get into the winter, and essentially the offensives, my understanding of it, of course, I'm deferring to the expert here, will have to be done mainly during the summertime months. So that gives only a few weeks, perhaps, for any potential advances for the Ukrainians. My point is if this enters roughly about with the same lines right now, heading into the winter, what happens at that point, and what do you foresee at that point?
Well, the advance will slow down for sure. You're absolutely right about it, right? The muddy season will start around October, maybe November. But at that point, you cannot move any heavy military equipment anymore at any significant speed. So that is definitely a problem. But the Ukrainians are actually waiting for new cruise missiles being delivered by Germany, the Taurus system. So that might make a difference, at least, that during the time, during the winter, you can soften up the Russian defenses. So yes, we cannot expect any big advances during the winter, but we can definitely still expect that the Ukrainians use their military equipment to undermine the Russian defense systems.
And I guess my final question that I have for you, Professor, is I kind of always end by asking you this: is what do you see as the potential end to this conflict, and if so, what would a potential timing to that look like?
Well, I think I've been saying that for a year and a half. So, like, the biggest game changer could be, of course, the removal of Putin from power. Either he's been forced from power or he dies, natural or not so natural circumstances. That would probably change the game quite a bit. Where that came from, like a year and a half ago, I said I have no idea, and then suddenly Prigozhin came like 2 months ago. So it's not out. Yeah. We can imagine that this is gonna happen. It's not very likely though. The other one is that Putin at some point realizes that he is not going to win this. That from here on out he is gonna lose territory, not win or gain additional territory, and that at that point he might be willing to actually sit down to negotiate. But any kind of negotiation requires that the Ukrainians are clearly armed, well equipped, trained. The motivation is not an issue. The Ukrainians are very motivated to fight back the Russians, but that the Russians realize that this is gonna be a stalemate, and at that point negotiations might happen. That would probably take another year. I had hoped for much quicker, and I have hoped for Putin, and I still hope that Putin might actually be driven from power. But if that's going to happen or not, even seasoned political scientists have a hard time predicting that.
And by the way, I said that was going to be my final question. I actually have a really quick one to that. What's interesting to me about what happened here with Prigozhin and Surovkin is it seems like that throughout the majority of Putin's tenure, he's been fighting back to people from his left. I think about Navalny and people to kind of his left. In this case, he's kind of fighting people to his right, more nationalistic views, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah. He's fighting actually on both fronts. The far, I mean, not the far, they're not on the left, right? I mean, if you look at Navalny is also nationalist, but he believes in, Western values, democracy, liberalism, and nationalism is a bit of a problem. But generally speaking, these folks are not too far off. And then you have these radicals on the right, but he has been able to kind of control them quite well. And now with Prigozhin's death, I assume that threat for a while is not acute anymore.
Interesting, but obviously something we'll continue to check back in with you about. CU Denver professor Christoph Stevas, who specializes in Russian studies and Eastern European studies. Thank you so much for taking a few minutes of your time here to join us and lend us your expertise about the conflict. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.